Yeah, so the title of the talk is Selves Beyond the Skin, Tetsuro-Watsuji's contribution to phenomenological approaches to dementia. Doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. Sorry, it's a long title. The Just a little bit of context. So about a year and a half ago, I guess it was it last, or maybe last summer, I guess. I actually can't remember now. I have no sense of time post-COVID. I guess it was last summer, wasn't it, Erik? When we were all up in Dublin at this really lovely conference that Daniel Petherbridge had organized on dementia and embodiment. He invited quite a few really stellar figures working in this area to come together and talk about various themes having to do with dementia and embodiment for a few days. So I had to throw together a talk at the time on that topic, even though it's not something I explicitly work on, until I was asked to contribute to a volume on cross-cultural approaches to the self, and the paper that I circulated that perhaps some of you have read was submitted for that volume. And so there's a lot of talk about the self and Watsuji. That's the motivation, the context for this paper and the talk today. So let me just start the talk with a quote that I really like. This is a quote from Roger Ames and Henry Rosemont. This is in their book that is primarily around Confucian ethics, but it relates to some themes that I want to talk about today. They say that the starting point is simple. Association is a fact. We do not live our lives inside our skins. Everything we do, they continue, physically, psychologically, and socially, is resolutely transactional and collaborative. And I really, really love that quote. I think it captures something I think that I want to think a bit about today in terms of what sort of self-loss or self-world disruptions occur in dementia. And Lars Christer Heiden has this lovely quote that speaks to this. I'm sure many of you here are familiar with his work. He says that dementia tends to disrupt the established everyday relations between identity, self, brain, body, and world. The challenges concern not only memory and social cognition, but also the organization and performance of bodily actions and movements. So he urges us to think about these issues in a very embodied way. Now, what I want to do today is to ask the question, what happens when our ability to live our lives outside the skin is somehow impeded or begins to weaken or dissolve? And what I would like to do is take a concept from Serena Parekh. She talks about the idea of ontological deprivation, and she defines it this way. She said, for Parekh's, ontological deprivation refers to different ways that individuals can be situated outside the ground from which we engage meaningfully with others and a shared world. And Parekh is primarily concerned with this notion in the context of political refugees, asylum seekers. I want to think about this more explicitly in the context of dementia. And I think bringing this concept into dialogue with Japanese philosopher Tetsuro Watsuji can, I hope, be productive. So I have two main objectives with the talk today. The first is just to introduce you to someone that many of you might not be familiar with. This is a Japanese philosopher and a phenomenologist named Tetsuro Watsuji, who was primarily active during the early half of the last century. And then I want to say a little bit about what I think the practical significance of his contribution is when it comes to thinking about issues of self-embodiment and dementia. And the main idea I want to suggest is that Watsuji can provide additional phenomenological insights into at least some of the relational disruptions that Lars Christer and others are talking about when they adopt this more embodied approach to dementia. And I think specifically Watsuji's concepts of betweenness or aidagara, which I'll define in a little bit, and his discussion of the social nature of intentionality and the scaffolded self can help here. And more precisely, what I want to suggest is that while other phenomenologists like Merleau-Ponty, Heidegger, Husserl, the usual suspects that are often brought into these discussions of dementia and the self are really helpful, I think Watsuji offers some additional descriptive resources for thinking about, again, what sort of self-loss individuals experience in dementia and why this Watsujian betweenness-centered framework matters for thinking about issues of treatment and intervention. So 4 parts to the talk today. A little bit of background, just to set the scene for those of you who aren't familiar with Watsuji. Part 2, I'm going to look more carefully at what he has to say about the social nature of intentionality, betweenness, and the scaffolded self, as we might refer to it. Part 3, I'm going to put this framework to work in the context of dementia. If you read the paper, you saw that I also talk about solitary confinement and dementia as two forms of ontological deprivation, or two ways of thinking about the different dynamics of self-loss. But I'm not going to talk about solitary confinement today, just dementia. And then one slide of some hand-wavy final thoughts, and then I'll stop. Okay, so a bit of background. So who was Watsuji? Well, Tetsuro Watsuji was a Japanese philosopher. He died in 1960. He is traditionally thought of as a member of the Kyoto school of Japanese philosophy that some of you might be familiar with. This is a school of philosophy that originated in Kyoto, Japan. Kitaro Nishide was the founder of the Kyoto school. Other notable figures included Hajime Tanabe, Keiji Nishitani, Masao Abe, and others. Whereas many of Watsuji's colleagues focused on more traditional philosophical topics like metaphysics, epistemology, philosophy of mind, philosophy of religion, these sorts of things, Watsuji was primarily concerned with culture and ethics. He is also deeply informed by his engagement with phenomenology, as we're going to see. And he also is informed by a rich engagement with Zen Buddhism. So he tries to essentially to bring some insights from Zen Buddhism into dialogue with phenomenology. I'm not going to say as much about the Buddhist dimension of Watsuji's thought today, even though it's quite interesting. And he has two books translated into English. His most notable book is a book called Rinrigaku, Ethics. And although it's ostensibly about ethics, Rinrigaku is actually about everything but ethics. He talks about Aidagara, this notion of betweenness that I'll talk about in a minute, a rich analysis of embodiment, phenomenological structures of embodiment, space, emptiness, or non-duality. That's where the Buddhist stuff comes in. Philosophy as a transformative practice, and many, many other things. And ultimately, Watsuji is occupied with this constellation of different topics in a treatise on ethics, because he thinks ultimately ethics is not just a study of abstract principles or norms. It begins with a study of the self that is or practices or embodies our ethics. So he thinks he has to go through all these different topics to understand what a self is before he can then go on to talk about ethics and the way that we embody ethics. Now, his core claim throughout this text is that consciousness, the self, subjectivity, whatever term we want to use, is social all the way down. Now, you might think when you hear something like that, well, phenomenologists think that too. To be a subject is always to be intersubjectively constituted, and yes. But I think he goes even a bit further, as we're going to see, than a lot of phenomenologists. He has a very strong way of interpreting this idea that consciousness and the self are irreducibly social. And consciousness, specifically for Watsuji from the start, is determined by various forms of betweenness, rich contexts of relationality that we'll talk about in a minute, that shape both the intentional character and the intentional content of consciousness. To put this another way, betweenness, interpersonal, sociocultural contexts of betweenness, regulate the deep structure, we might put it, of the self. And taking seriously the role of betweenness in shaping consciousness and self blurs firm distinction between interiority and exteriority, subject and object. That's again where the Buddhist, I think, influence is really most prominent in his thinking. So with this background, this is at this point that Watsuji develops his social view of intentionality by engaging with and critiquing, ultimately, phenomenological figures like Husserl and Heidegger. So I just should note that Watsuji was writing a lot of his most important phenomenological insights before Merleau-Ponty. He was one of the first critics of Heidegger. He was sent over to Germany shortly after the publication of Being and Time to study with Heidegger. The Japanese government at the time funded the trips of very promising students abroad to go study with prominent scholars elsewhere. And Watsuji had arrived, was going to study with Heidegger, and then his father became very ill and died. And so Watsuji cut his trip short and went back to Japan. But I should note that his even just encounter with Being in Time, just being in the air during that time, and a little bit of time that he did spend in Germany had a very deep influence on him. And he wrote what was one of the first sustained criticisms of Being in Time, for ultimately neglecting sociality and spatiality, he thinks. I just wanted to flag that historical point. So let's turn now to Watsuji's notion of intentionality and the social nature of intentionality. Before then, we consider how this all relates to dementia. So just to remind ourselves, when we're talking about intentionality in a phenomenological context, this term comes from the Latin to aim, to hold out, or to stretch. And when phenomenologists talk about intentionality, of course, they're talking about not something having to do with volition or willing, such as I intend to do this, but rather they're talking about the ability of consciousness to be about things, to be directed towards, or to aim at different objects, things, events, states of affairs. These different things provide content for mental states. These are intentional objects of our different mental states, like perceiving and believing and remembering and emotional states, etc. And what's unique about, I think, phenomenological contributions to a discussion of intentionality is that intentionality is not just this bare encounter with a value-free world. There's a very deep way in which subjects, perceiving subjects, actively constitute intentional objects for phenomenologists as content by various meaning-bestowing acts. So minds encounter a world, but the world doesn't simply press back onto minds. There's a sense in which minds play an active role in constituting the kind of world that they encounter and the way that things in that world are experienced. And be very clear about this, of course, phenomenologists are not endorsing kind of idealism. We don't create objects, but we experience them in particular sorts of ways by modes of presentation that determine their salience and character, how they show up for us. So, for example, we see an apple in the world. We can see that apple constituted as an intentional object many different ways. We can see it as a piece of fruit. I can perceive that apple as a gala apple, a particular kind of apple, as my colleague's lunch, as a weapon, if I need to throw it for some reason, as something to be painted, as an aesthetic object, in many, many other ways. And this is how Husserl puts this idea. He says that the objects of which we are conscious are not simply found in consciousness as in a box. They are first constituted as being what they are for us and what they count as for us in various forms of objective intention. So Watsuji agrees with all of this. Excuse me, he says that phenomenologists are right to focus on intentionality when investigating the ontology of consciousness. That's what it is to be a subject in the world, to be aimed at or directed toward different objects, things, events, and states of affairs that provide content for consciousness. However, Watsuji thinks that predominantly what he thinks is a very individualistic and internalist, which is to say subject-object orientation or way of thinking about intentionality, overlooks what he argues is irreducibly social character. So in focusing so much on individual experience of intentionality, Watsuji argues, phenomenologists like Husserl and others overlook the extent to which the social context shapes the very form that our intentional activity or encounter with the world takes. So I want to turn to his critique more carefully now before then showing why all this matters for thinking about dementia and the self. So part two, intentionality betweenness and the scaffolded self in Watsuji. So he has a lot of really subtle arguments that I think are worthy of more extended consideration than I'm going to give them here. And I've tried to unpack some of these in some different works on Watsuji over the years. I think the core of his claim, I think, can be found in this passage. He says that what is called intentional activity, the way that phenomenologists traditionally think about it, is nothing more than the product of abstraction that first of all excludes the relational elements from our acts and then posits the residue as an activity of individual consciousness. So in other words, he argues, we first find ourselves within these rich, complex contexts of betweenness, interpersonal relations. And these contexts are what generate individual intentional acts. But phenomenologists, he argues, have traditionally kind of stripped away or abstracted intentional acts from this rich context of betweenness and think that they've isolated the essential structures of consciousness. But that's already a mistake, he argues. We need to first look at the context of betweenness in which intentional acts first arise. So what is betweenness, or a.r.t.e.s? That's the Japanese term. Well, short version is complicated. And I strongly encourage those of you who are interested in Watsuji and learning more about his thinking to read Erin's wonderful book, Erin McCarthy. She wrote a wonderful book some years ago called Ethics Embodied, Rethinking Selfhood Through Continental, Japanese, and Feminist Philosophies. And she develops, I think, an extraordinarily rich and subtle interpretation of Watsuji's notion of a.r.t.e.s, or betweenness. But for our purposes today, we can note that betweenness for Watsuji refers to various ways that human reality is organized, not just by its temporal structure, the way that Heidegger, of course, argues that it is, but also by various dimensions and intensities of spatiality. We are first and foremost not just temporal subject, we're spatial subjects. And this sort of spatiality, Watsuji argues, is not the same as space in the world of nature. Rather, it is lived space, the betweenness itself of subjective human beings. So this subjective spatiality, as he calls it, can take many, we might say, external forms. We can think about a kind of shared spatiality that arises within the kind of intimate dynamics of infant caregiver relations. There's a certain kind of quality of relatedness, a quality of spatial connectedness and intimacy that arises within these dynamics. Or we can think about the way that a group at a sporting event can be caught up in the collective euphoria when the home team scores a goal. We feel connected suddenly to 80, 90,000 people that we're sharing that space with. Or a particular quality of presence, a kind of, again, a kind of intimacy, a kind of trust, a kind of experience of safety that might arise in the context of a confessional booth, a Catholic confessional booth. But of course, internet-enabled technologies, new forms of communication technologies also generate and give rise to potentially very rich forms of spatial connectedness. And so my philosophical friend and colleague, Lucy Osler, here in Cardiff, and I have done some work looking at what Watsuji has to say about, potentially, about online space. Now, these are all, I think, potentially really rich and interesting ways of thinking about betweenness or spatiality, something external to the self. But for Watsuji, betweenness is also something internal to the self. It's an internal principle of what it means to be an embodied subject in the world. So the dialectical unity, as he puts it, of our embodied being means that we exist in between both subjectivity and objectivity. We're neither just subjects nor are we just objects, we're somehow both. To be an embodied subject, an agent in the world, is to exist perpetually within this middle space between being a pure object and a subject, to exist in the dynamics, the tension of that oscillation between subjectivity and objectivity. So how does all this relate to intentionality? Well, let me just try to very quickly sketch what his argument here is before then turning to dementia. So again, for Watsuji, the intentional acts that embodied subjects engage in when they encounter and interact with the world are not just embodied. They don't just reflect features of our embodiment. They are always situated acts, situated forms of intentional activity that are robustly situated in socio-material contexts of betweenness. And again, his key point, the argument he makes, is that the form that these intentional acts take, which in turn determines their character and content, both how they feel to the subject who engages in them, as well as the kind of objects, intentional objects, that subjects constitute within these intentional acts. The form these acts take, which in turn determines their character and content, is, as he puts it, structurally qualified or modified by the dynamics of the context of betweenness in which they arise. There's a way in which, to put it more simply, the social world kind of bleeds into and shapes the way that intentional activity arises in the first place. So betweenness is primary, even before there is an intentional subject. So he has a lot of different ways he tries to make this argument. He goes through a number of different experiences, candidate experiences, he thinks, that one might initially think kind of are solitary experiences. These are kinds of intentional forms of intentional acts, he thinks, that one might potentially think reflect our individuality. So experience of solitude, just perceiving the world, desires, many other kinds of experiences. And one by one, he argues each one of these are shaped by pre-existing contexts of betweenness. So I'm just going to give you one example to give you a sense of the flavor of his argument. So he talks about desires. You might think, for example, that we are individuated as subjects by the unique constellation of desires that we possess. The things that I like, the things that my aesthetic preferences, my desires, all this stuff is what makes me me. This is what makes me unique. There's a sense in which those preferences are individually determined. But Watsuji says, nope. As a matter of fact, while token episodes of desiring, so an individual intentional act of, for example, desiring a piece of cake, desiring a Belgian beer, as I often do, wanting to take a holiday, lusting after a particular celebrity. We might think that all these token episodes of desiring are uniquely ours, and perhaps they are. The character and content of that desire, the type of desire they reflect, in other words, the way the intentional object is constituted, from within the act of the desiring experience is social, he says, is socially qualified or modified. To put it more simply, in short, we learn both what to desire and how to desire from others. That process, that intentional activity, the form of that intentional activity is socially qualified or modified, to use his language. We learn how to constitute the world as full of desirous objects in the first place from others. So Thomas Sordus has this nice expression. He makes a similar claim. He says that this is the sociologist Thomas Sordus. Some of you might know his work, deeply influenced by phenomenology. Sordus argues that via enculturated somatic modes of intention, as he puts it, we become bodily sensitive to features of our world as worthy of our desirous attention in the first place. We learn how to encounter and how to constitute a world as populated by desire-worthy things from others, from the dynamics of our context of betweenness in which our intentional activity arises. And again, the point is just the ontogenesis of this attention. It's a fancy way of saying that the development of these forms of attention that give us the world as an arena for our desires. The ontogenesis of this attention is regulated by betweenness. And there's a lot of developmental evidence that supports this. So Watsuji likes to talk about babies, infants, and caregivers. He didn't have access, of course, to a lot of the empirical developmental psychology that we do today, but he was very attuned to how much we can learn from watching how infants and caregivers interact. So as a result of this, a lot of his examples in Rinrigaku discuss the way that infants and caregivers enact their own very distinctive, qualitatively rich forms of betweenness from birth. And so from birth, attention management is a socially scaffolded process. We learn, again, how to regulate our attention, how to regulate our emotions. We learn what to pay attention to, what not to pay attention to from caregivers. To put this a little more formally, caregivers provide exogenous mechanisms, so beyond the head mechanisms, out in the context of betweenness around us, that entrain neonates into culturally saturated habits of mind, forms of intentional activity that create the world, again, that we experience within our intentional activity. So a lot of evidence looking at different strategies, cross-cultural strategies for regulating attention and emotions in infants. So unlike, for example, the way that infants and children are expected to be kind of more proactive and present within public spaces in North America and Scandinavian countries, where children are often allowed to be very vocal, expressive, present in all sorts of social contexts. This is not the case in other cultures. So Zulu mothers will routinely use a range of vocal and gestural strategies to downregulate, I should say, their children's attention and emotions, which shapes their desires and behavior in the presence of adults. So children are expected to be less socially present, more still, have more focused attention, kind of more tightly controlled emotion regulation strategies. And caregivers play an active role in shaping the embodied enculturation of these practices within infants, which in turn, again, shape their desires and behavior in the presence of adults. So it's a way in which the socio-cultural context of betweenness enters into and shapes the form and character of the intentional activity that infants in those cultural contexts exhibit. And just this is the last point I'm going to make about this before then turning to dementia. There's some really cool empirical work that supports this further, kind of the deep way that processes of attention, emotion regulation, and even perception are regulated by contexts of betweenness. So some of you might have heard of this before. There's some interesting studies, eye tracking studies, that found that East Asian subjects, in contrast to North American, Canadian, and American subjects, East Asian subjects will spend more time looking at the background of an image and relational features of the context than do American or Canadian subjects. So in these situations, test subjects brought into a room, they are put in front of a computer, they're shown a sequence of images, airplanes, family scenes, natural scenes, etc. And then eye tracking software can monitor where these individuals are looking, where they spend most of their time looking. After they view these images, they're then asked to recall details of these images to the investigator. And again, what these tests have found is that East Asian subjects tend to appeal more to relational or contextual features of the scene when reconstructing a scene, looking at the background or the context, family relations, literally the space in between individuals, than do American or Canadian subjects. And this distinction is even found in children's drawing, as well as the intentional patterns in 24-month-old infants, differences in the way that US children versus Chinese infants engage with the world, what they look at and how long they look at certain things. So the point of all of this, why I've taken this little detour here, is to kind of provide a bit of argument, a bit of context and support for what Tzuchi's core claim, that the structure of somatic forms of attention reflect very specific features of our sociocultural context of betweenness. In other words, the acts by which intentional objects show up as content are from birth regulated by factors outside our skin, anchored in the people and things, the context of betweenness around us. And in this way, what Tzuchi argues, intentionality is not an individualistic mind over and against a world, an individualistic self against a world full of objects. Rather, consciousness is social. Betweenness regulates the deep structures, as we might say, of consciousness, intentionality, and the self. Okay, so that's a lot of background, a lot of setup. Let's get to the dementia stuff. I suspect this is what most of you here are most interested in. And so again, in the longer version of the paper that I sent, and once again, if you did slog your way through it, thank you for taking the time to do that. You'll remember there's stuff on solitary confinement that I'm not going to talk about. But I do think that solitary confinement is useful, as is dementia, when it comes to thinking about an answer to the question, what happens to these deep structures of consciousness in the self that I was just talking about, when our ability to live our lives outside our skin is somehow impeded or begins to weaken or dissolve? And solitary confinement is, of course, I think, a very profound example of that. I appeal to Lisa Gunter's work, that I think has made a really forceful phenomenological argument that solitary confinement is in many ways a destruction of the self, a breakdown of intentionality and basic intentional ways of engaging with the world. In other words, it's a form, as is to a certain degree, as we're going to see dementia, a form of what Serena Parrott calls ontological deprivation. Again, these are different ways that individuals can be somehow come to be situated outside of the context of betweenness that we need to regulate and sustain ourselves as intentional subjects in the world. Now, Park has done some really wonderful work looking at this concept of ontological deprivation in the context of refugee and asylum seekers, the experience of forced displacement. He argues that prolonged periods of spending time, for example, in refugee camps can itself lead to forms of self-dissolution that have to be taken very seriously in these contexts. And in the papers I mentioned that I had circulated, I talk about in the context of solitary confinement and dementia. Just going to focus on what we might think about as ontological deprivation in the context of dementia. I think the contrast, though, with solitary confinement is interesting because both are often spoken about now as kind of dissolution of the self, a breakdown or loss of self. Now, solitary confinement is a deliberate breakdown of supporting contexts of betweenness and a deliberate dissolution of the self enacted as a form of punishment. What can we learn about ways of preserving and reconstructing the dissolving self, we might say, from dementia? So if we get sort of the dark side of betweenness and self-loss in solitary confinement, what maybe positive lessons can we look at kind of reconstructing contexts of betweenness and rebuilding a self in the context of dementia? And what might Tzuchi contribute to this perspective? So that's what I'm thinking about in the remaining part of this talk. So again, I think this is familiar to this group. I'm quite sure know this literature better than I do. But just to remind ourselves that within the literature on dementia, there's a common narrative that sees or frames dementia as a kind of self-loss. It's often spoken of as a gradual dissolution or even loss of self, a kind of living death. So we find expressions like the following: dementias, a drifting towards the threshold of unbeing, or other formulations such as, what is so devastating about the relentless nature of dementia is the very splintering of the sedimented layers of being until there's nothing left, and that the victim of Alzheimer's must eventually come to terms with the complete loss of self. So very strong language that links dementia with self-loss. And this language, as Julian Hughes and others have observed, stems from what Hughes calls a Locke-Parfit view of the person. So this very kind of cognitivist or mentalistic way of thinking about selves is grounded in certain psychological states, such as autobiographical memory, it's Locke's classic view, and their overlapping synchronic and diachronic connections between these states that sustains the cognitive or mental self through time. And that, of course, is Parfit's view on the self. And if we lose the ability either to form these states, such as memory, or to maintain a kind of synchronic and diachronic connection between our different psychological states, we begin to experience a dissolution of the self, a breakdown or loss of the cognitive self. Now, within recent decades, quite a few researchers, including people here, have, I think, very productively and convincingly challenged these very mentalistic ways of thinking about the self in dementia research. I think it's fair to say that within the past few decades, dementia research has taken on an embodied turn. You can see some of the authors that I know are familiar to many of you. Of course, Erik has done great work in this regard. But Julian Hughes, Lars Christer Heiden, Lisa Call, Pia Cantos, Daniel Petherbridge, Kristen Tuvins, many others. A lot of these folks were at the lovely conference that Daniel hosted last summer. And simply put, these embodied approaches look to ground selfhood, not within individual psychological states or capacity to form psychological states, such as autobiographical memories, but rather within the pre-reflective body. And more specifically, they argue that selfhood, aspects of the self, are both maintained and preserved within different forms of the pre-reflective body's agency and forms of expression. So things like our habitual habits, our ways of gesturing, our ways of carrying ourselves, posture, movements, facial expressions, all these embodied habits that mark us as unique and distinct, as well as the dynamics by which these embodied capacities are shaped by socialization and cultural upbringing. Again, everyday context of betweenness, to use Watsuji's language. So here's how Pia Cantos, who's been at the forefront of a lot of this work, puts this. She says that selfhood is embodied and characterized by an observable coherence and capacity for improvisation that is sustained at a pre-reflective level by the primordial as well as the sociocultural significance of the body. In other words, this perspective, to use the language I'm using for this talk, recognizes that selves are not things that just are either formed, emerge, or are lost just inside our head. There's a sense in which embodied selves are formed and sustained beyond the skin. So while an individual with dementia may suffer severe memory loss and have difficulty speaking, they may lose the psychological capacities that are often in this Locke-Parfit framework thought to be essential for selfhood. Many aspects of the bodily spatial self remain intact. And this means that these aspects are publicly discernible to loved ones and caregivers, the networks of betweenness that are around them. So there are often different aspects of the bodily self that these approaches pick out that I think are thinking about in a more careful way. What is it that is preserved? What aspects of the self are preserved when we're talking about the pre-reflective body? Well, so we're talking about things like bodily expression. So here we can talk about what idiosyncratic ways of gesturing, smiling, winking, or frowning, distinctive ways of speaking, intonation, vocalizing, even in the absence of words, so humming or just making other noises, or even within one's more general bodily comportment, kind of way of moving through the world, a way of inhabiting space. Pia has some wonderful work looking at the way that individuals incorporate walkers, for example, into their style of embodied comportment. I think Erik has done some nice work, if I remember correctly, on wheelchair users as well, similar dynamics. We can talk about forms of self-presentation. So this is not just focusing on embodiment, but focusing on the role that material culture, so clothing that individuals wear, wearing favorite clothing as a way of projecting aspects of the bodily self to the world. Individuals pausing to freshen up their lipstick before going to dinner is a form of self-expression. Pia talks about that. Or she has another nice case of an individual who, every time a caregiver will secure the bib of this woman, this woman would reach behind her neck to display a prized string of pearls. Every time the bib would be adjusted, she would take her pearls out to make sure that her pearls were showing and conveying the self-image she wanted to convey to the world. Habits of social etiquette. So habitually pushing in a chair after finishing a meal, for example, or individuals, including those with severe cognitive impairments, who nevertheless say thank you each time a caregiver wipes food from their chin. So Cantos talks about, again, certain kind of habits of social etiquette that remain even when other psychological abilities begin to dissolve. And then finally, this is one that really stayed with me when she was talking about this in Dublin. I was quite moved by this. She was describing comforting strategies that residents of a care home will often enact in relation to one another. The residents, for example, may soothe other residents who are visibly distressed by gently placing a hand on the resident's forearm, singing songs or lullabies to comfort individuals that reflect the person singing them, their cultural or social heritage. And of course, music is an important part of care homes and bringing out and scaffolding the emergence of bodily selves. So concerts and sing-alongs are often popular within care homes. They are opportunities for spontaneous dancing and play, embodied play. They are, in other words, as Kantos puts it, engagements with the world and ways to interact with coherence, purpose, and meaning that help to articulate a distinctive, pre-reflective bodily profile. Again, a bodily self that's preserved. Now, what's the practical significance of this? So again, I think Watsuji can contribute some useful descriptive resources here when it comes to thinking through the dynamics of embodied selfhood and what does it mean to say that the self is somehow preserved within the pre-reflective structures of the body in dementia. I think he can contribute to that project as well, along with people like Merleau-Ponty and others. But I also think taking betweenness seriously, the relationship between betweenness and the self seriously, potentially opens the door to some new ways of thinking about intervention and care. So this is what the practical significance of all of this is. So Julia Twigg has observed that the hard, plastic, easy wipe, easy care, polyester world, as she puts it, of traditional care homes for dementia patients. I love that expression. The hard, plastic, easy wipe, easy care, polyester world of traditional care homes, along with the standardized modes of dress. So again, easy care fabrics that require no ironing, trousers permanently fastened to prevent exposure, dresses and overalls that open at the back for ease of toileting, fix the classic look of the dementia patient. So they don't give individuals the opportunity to express and scaffold their bodily subjectivity. They, in a sense, kind of constrain or close down possibilities for these expressions. They are clothing and design decisions that are made to make life easier for caregivers, not to open up possibilities for self-expression within residents. More formally, by prioritizing efficiency and control within the design of these spaces, context of betweenness, this clothing and these spaces underscore the materializing effect of institutional regimes on the body and shape the kinds of behavior and bodily selves that emerge within them. But again, I think an embodied and betweenness-centered approach reflects a greater sensitivity to the link between bodily selves and space, context of betweenness, and suggests other intervention possibilities. So one example that I think is very much a betweenness-centered approach to dementia is something called the Dementia Village. I think Hogevik, I think is how you pronounce it, just outside of Amsterdam. Again, I suspect most of you are familiar with this example. This is a care facility located just outside of Amsterdam that consists of essentially kind of a square of apartments, individual apartments where residents live. Each one is unique, individually designed, along with other kind of offices and care facilities for the caregivers. But then within this dementia village, this space, is what amounts to a kind of high street. This is a space in which the residents are free to wander and to go to places like they can go have their hair done. You can see from that picture there, there's a pub, they can go have a drink, there's a movie theater, hairstylist, they can go shopping to the market, all the while being surrounded by caregivers who are dressed in plain clothes and who are keeping a very close watch on the residents. But the point is that this is a space of the context of betweenness in which individuals can act the rhythms of everyday life. They can dress the way they want, interact with people, so they're out in the world living everyday life in a way that lets them develop and express their embodied subjectivity and exhibit a kind of autonomy of freedom and an individuality that is not achievable in other more restricted care contexts. But I think there's some other cases we can look to that really support the value and the urgency of a more betweenness-centered approach to dementia that involves, in other words, taking the environment seriously and the role of betweenness and its relation to the self. So here's an example that some of you maybe perhaps aren't as familiar with. So some years ago, Carolyn Baum, who's an occupational therapist, she found that a sizable subpopulation of inner city in St. Louis, Missouri in the US, Alzheimer patients still lived alone and successfully, despite the fact that these individuals fared poorly on standardized tests for memory loss and Alzheimer's, so the SARAD protocol. I think that's how you pronounce it, I'm not sure. And the question was, well, how do they do this? How are these individuals able to maintain some degree of functioning and autonomy, despite the fact that they fared so poorly on these standardized tests and that it should have been in a care home according to these measurements. Well, the answer Baum found, and this is not her language, of course, I'm using Watsuji's language here, but after going to look at how these individuals lived their lives and organized their lives, she found that their home environments became self-curated contexts of betweenness, we might say, that scaffold cognitive function and somatic modes of attention. In other words, these individuals deliberately employed a range of strategies to organize their home spaces, not just with props, tools, aids, and other spatial design decisions that supported not just memory and cognitive functioning, but also their agency and their bodily spatial orientation as they move through these home spaces. So just to give you some concrete examples here, individuals within these homes very often would have message centers, kind of centralized repositories that were very easy to see in the kitchen or another place where they would spend a lot of time, where they kept notes about what to do and when. They would display photos of family and friends with little sticky notes, with names and relationships. They would put labels and pictures on cabinet doors. So instead of hiding important stuff in cabinets, they would have the labels explicitly labeled, or the cabinets labeled, so it was easy to find. Many of them used memory books to write down and record new events, meetings, and plans. And then more generally, they would employ open storage strategies, again, where crucial items like food or medicine were kept in plain view, once again, instead of being hidden inside a cabinet or a drawer where it's easier to get lost. I think taking seriously this relationship, again, between context of betweenness and the self, and opens up new possibilities for what Christina Buse and colleagues call materialities of care. So again, ways to bring the world into our care strategies. So Buse and colleagues have done some really nice work looking at the role that bringing the world and an individual's world, kind of self-styled context, into their care strategy can make during the time when they transition from independent living to a nursing home. So Buse and colleagues have found that this transition from independent living at home in one's self-styled space to a nursing home is predictably a major cause of loss, of grieving, and a sense of disorientation for elderly patients. And not surprisingly, you're taking one individual out of their familiar context of betweenness. Maybe they've lived there for many decades, they've raised a family, they've been married, whatever, and you're putting them in an entirely new space in which they literally feel that they're not at home, disoriented, unable to develop and bring out their full embodied subjectivity. So now many care homes and hospices now allow residents to bring their space with them, essentially, kind of transplant their personal context of betweenness from their home to their new nursing home. So they allow residents to bring their own furniture and personal objects and create their own space where they in fact feel at home. And they found that this has a lot of positive benefits. It restores a kind of feeling of at-homeness, a kind of affective trust, feeling emotionally connected to that environment and at home. It's a way of preserving, Buse and colleagues argue, continuity of the self. They feel that they have not left this former life and all the expressions of the self that were part of it behind, but they've carried it with them into this new context of care. And it also has a really valuable role in stabilizing mood and attention, gives them access to memories, narratives, embodied habits and associations that make that transition easier and help them feel more bodily at home in that space. So final thoughts, then I'm done. So what have I tried to suggest here? Well, I just sort of tried to sketch out some ways that I suggested that Watsuji, and specifically his analysis of betweenness, can bring out what we might see as the other side of Serena Parekh's ontological deprivation. So thinking about not what happens when we lose access to context of betweenness and the self begins to dissolve, but how can reconstructing aspects of betweenness, which is what I was trying to talk about at the end, how is that process of reconstructing aspects of betweenness at the same time a reconstruction of the self? And I think taking seriously not just these embodied, but we might say more kind of situated or betweenness-centered perspectives suggests that rather focusing on narratives of deficit, deficiency, and loss in dementia, which, along with their neuropathology, may contribute to the alienation and suffering that many individuals with dementia experience. I think Watsuji can instead contribute to alternative emerging narratives of relational citizenship in dementia treatment that sees individuals as playing a participatory role, a proactive role in their own care. And ultimately, I think this kind of not just an embodied, but a betweenness-centered approach can compel us to consider new techniques and interventions for the promotion of selfhood in dementia, based upon a more holistic definition of what care is, according to Jenkins. And I think she put it beautifully. So with that, I'm just going to stop. Thanks for paying attention. And yeah, I look forward to your questions.